Hello and welcome back to the Braw Tech Podcast. My name is Amy Kelly and I am with Beena Sharma today, founder and CEO of CCU International. So thank you so much for being here today, Beena. How are you?
Fine, thank you. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for making the time. So just to kick us off, Beena, can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm the CEO and co-founder of CCU International. My background is actually, I grew up in London. In North London, to be precise. I'm one of 5 siblings. I'm number 4. I spent most of my life in London, really until I went to university. And then straight out of university, I went into the oil and gas industry. So at 21 years old, I was by the time I hit 22, I was actually in Nigeria. So I worked on an LNG plant there, and I've kind of lived all over the world in very remote parts of the world. The longest stint I did was 2.5 years in Norway on a gas plant. And more recently, I now live in Aberdeen. So I've been there for coming up to 3 years. But my background, interestingly, isn't a tech background, and I'm not an engineer. My background is psychology. So I specialized in behavioral change programs for the oil and gas industry, specifically in health and safety, it was very, there weren't many of us, let's say, that did it back then. So it was quite unique to be doing something like that, very niche. And really that's the background I come from. So not technical, not an engineer, which people are quite often surprised to hear given the kind of company that I run.
Yeah, and I'd love for us to just get a bit of insight into that company as well. So, and also, can you tell us why you started CCU International?
Yeah, so CCU International, what we do effectively is we capture CO2, so carbon dioxide emissions from any industry, chimney, or exhaust or flue stack. So anywhere where you see a chimney where there's burning of coal, for example, natural gas, wood, for example, so your waste to energy plants, your refineries, your steel plants, or even your paper mills, for example, which we have in the UK. Anywhere where there's a chimney stack that sends those emissions up through the chimney stack, we actually extract the emissions before it goes up the chimney stack, and we separate the CO2. That's the carbon dioxide. So that's the stuff that harms our environment. We're always hearing about, the effect that CO2 has on climate change. So the idea is that in order for us to meet climate change targets, we need to reduce the amount of CO2 that's in our atmosphere. So it is said that potentially around 50% of our emissions can be reduced by carbon capture alone. So it's a huge incentive to work in this space. And according to the UN, carbon capture is a key technology in achieving net zero by 2045 in Scotland, 2050 and beyond everywhere else. So the technology itself captures those emissions, and then we take that CO2 and we create product from it. So we try and create, it's a commodity. CO2 is a commodity, right? It goes into food and beverage. Every time you open your can of Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Dr. Pepper or Iron Brew in Scotland, it's carbonated. And it also goes in all our food to keep our food fresh. So if you imagine salads, for example, they're often quite full of air. People think it's just air, but it's actually CO2. Concentrations of CO2 are in there to keep the food fresh for longer. So, and it goes into a lot of our plastics manufacturing. I mean, most of us don't realize how much CO2 we actually use. And what we're trying to do is create circularity of that CO2. So take the CO2, utilize it. We know we're going to be burning fossil carbon for many, many years to come. So why don't we try and create a process whereby we can capture those emissions and then reintroduce them back into industry rather than take more from fossil carbon, if that makes sense. So that's what we do. That's what the technology does. And really the journey started about 13 or 14 years ago. And it was one of my co-founders, a guy called Professor Peter Styring. He's pretty world renowned for the stuff that he does in carbon capture. He's more of a policy guy now, so he spends a lot of his time advising governments, particularly our government, on carbon capture utilization specifically. And he is based at the University of Sheffield. He worked on one of the UK's first ever carbon capture projects, which was called Ferrybridge CC100+. It was designed to capture 100 tons of CO2. It was a power plant. It was an SSE, Doosan Babcock, and I think it was a Vattenfall project. And long story short, it was a 27 million project. The technology that was used, Peter often describes as the size of a city. So it's large, very energy intensive, very expensive, and used hazardous substances. So there was question around how carbon efficient it was. And long story short, after 2 years, it didn't really work and it was shut down. They decommissioned. So he came away from that project thinking, well, we talk about carbon capture being a key technology and getting us to net zero. But if we're serious about it, it needs to be smaller. It needs to be more energy efficient. It needs to be more cost effective. And more importantly, we need to not use hazardous substances to do it. And that's really where his research started from. So he began developing this capture system at the University of Sheffield. As with most universities, it's not the easiest thing to develop the technology within the university. So he spent a lot of time trying to convince the university to help him develop this technology. But really, as an academic, the idea was that actually you need somebody commercial behind it to drive it forward and maybe some investment. And that's where we came along, myself and my other co-founder. So Peter was based at the university along with Dr. George Dowson, who he worked in e-fuels. So he worked in the space that actually takes the CO2 and turns it into something. So because we can turn it into things like aviation fuels, diesel. The project that we're working on at the moment is turning it into surfactants, which is the stuff that goes into virtually every cleaning product, shampoo, shower gels. So the idea is that he used to work in that space. But what he struggled was to get hold of captured CO2 to do his research. And that's how he became involved in the project, because he said, well, actually, if we develop and build our own technology to capture the CO2, then we're not going to have problems with getting feedstock for research. And that's how he got involved. And at the same time, whilst building this, they decided to make it the most carbon efficient, energy, efficient system. And that's where it started from. Myself and my other co-founder, who is Francis, his background really is technical CFO. So he spent the last 15, 20 years, mostly in the Middle East, building the models, the financial models for these types of environmental technologies. And then from my perspective, it was more from a business, marketing, sales, even though I don't have that background, but I've been told I'm quite good at it. So I came in with that, and that both Francis and I are very commercial. We've worked together in the past. We've got another business as well. So we came together, and actually the technology that we wanted to launch was a circular food economy business, a biotechnical company. And in that process, we had 4 technologies to create this circular food economy. So we would take waste food and create things like spirulinas, and introduce things like vertical farming, etc. So it was very clever, and it's been being done in Abu Dhabi. It's being done in France. We wanted to bring it to the UK, and we were faced with so much regulation just to create things like animal feed that actually, when we pitched it to investors, they would quite often ask about the 4 technologies. And one of those technologies was anaerobic digestion, photobioreactors, and obviously the farming, the farming element. But one of those was, in one of the processes, we produced a lot of CO2. So we came to the conclusion, because we're all about circularity and not producing any waste, we need to find a technology that can capture that CO2 and do something with it, as opposed to just re-emitting it. So we started researching other carbon capture technologies that were out there, and we were just coming up against the bog standard, hazardous, large. We were like, this isn't going to work. And then somebody said, have you spoken to Professor Peter Styring at the University of Sheffield? And this was probably about 3 years ago now. And we had one conversation with him. Francis had one conversation with him, and we knew almost immediately this was the technology we had to commercialize. But then when we went to investors were like, tell me about the carbon capture technology. They weren't interested in anything else. And after a couple of months of doing this, we came to the realization that, we're going to have to spin this carbon capture technology out as a separate company, because that is what investors want. So that's really where it came from. We just listened to what the market was telling us, what investors were telling us, not being precious about the existing business and thinking, actually, how can we get to market quicker? And that way would be to look at the technology, spinning that technology out that is the one that everybody wants and needs. So we began our conversations with the university, and then obviously got an agreement in place, and have now spun out a university, a Unico, they call it.
That's a massive thing to take on. I feel like it's, it sounds like such a critical thing that is needed right now with the way that everything's moving. But for anyone that might not be as familiar about the climate tech industry, like, how is this sort of positioned in the market against like any other technology? So is it like completely unique in itself in the way that you solve the problems, or?
I think we have a problem, right? And this isn't just a UK or a Scotland-based problem. This is a worldwide problem. We see the major effects of climate change. And more we are seeing, displacement. They say for every percentage increase in temperature, global temperature, there are something like 1 billion people displaced. I mean, only, last year, the year before, we saw all the floods in Pakistan. Never happened before, the temperatures that we're seeing. So globally, we all know that this needs to happen. With regards to technology, I think it was probably last year, the numbers have come down yet, but we say that in order for us to get to net zero, they say that more than 50% of the technologies that we need to get there have not yet been invented or are at very early stage, probably sitting in universities, trying to become commercial. So the demand is obviously there. Everybody needs it. Every government needs it. The planet needs it. But also at the same time, we're not moving fast enough with regards to technology. So when there is a technology that comes along, and there've been many, carbon capture has been around for a very long time. Norway have been doing it for 25, 30 years. Canada have been doing it for just as long. Large companies like Shell and Equinor have been doing this for many, many years. But the technology that they're using is very dated. Some of these patents go back nearly 100 years. And although we haven't changed the technology much, what we have done is looked at the hazardous chemicals that we're using and just tried to make them more efficient, which isn't the answer. So our technology takes away all the elements of the problems that come with using hazardous substances. And the way I describe it quite often is you have to be able to answer the question, if I'm capturing 10 tons of CO2, how many tons of CO2 am I using to do that? Nobody's asking that question, right? If I'm using equivalent to 7 tons of CO2 from energy that's required to power this capture system, well, what's the point? Why am I capturing that 10 tons if I'm only really getting 2 tons or 3 tons credit towards it? When I'm using all this, wherever the energy comes from, whether it's from the grid. And also you have to think of the hazardous substances, chemicals that we're using. Every time we use these chemicals, they release, carcinogenic substances into the atmospheres that cause cancers, etc. Chemicals degrade. And when you use them, because they're generally not very robust, when you use them, you have to replenish them. Then you've got hazardous chemical, which you have to think about. Well, what do I do with the hazardous chemical? Every single step means more carbon emissions. So if you have to transport something, or you have to bring it in, or you have to change it out, or you need more people, it's all carbon emissions. So our remit is, when we built this capture system and developed this capture system, we wanted to make it so that anybody asking those questions, what is the energy requirement? How much carbon are you using to actually capture these emissions? That there is full transparency, because currently the industry doesn't have it. And that's probably why we're one of the disruptors, because we will possibly be the first ever carbon capture company, technology company, to publish our full, what we call life cycle analysis, a techno-economic analysis, and a social impact analysis. So the techno-economics, but also the social impact. What impact do these things have on the local environment and the people that live in that environment? And also the life cycle analysis, which takes the theory behind a life cycle analysis is you should be able to map the carbon emissions of that product from the time that you mine the product that you need to build to the manufacturing process. There's carbon emissions involved in every step, right? Manufacturing right the way through to transporting, to using, and to the end of life. We call it cradle to gate, gate to grave. So a full life cycle analysis takes into consideration all the carbon emissions of building that capture system and disposing of it, using it, disposing of it. And that hasn't been done publicly by any carbon capture company that we've come across. So the project that we're working on at the moment, and this really brings it home, because quite often most people hear about climate change, right? You hear about it and you talk about carbon dioxide. Nobody really knows what carbon dioxide looks like, or what it goes into, what we use it for. So the project that we're doing at the moment is a project called Flue2Chem. And that it's a world first. And actually we launched the business sort of December 2022. By January, we were selected as one of the technology providers on the project. We are actually the sole technology provider on the project. And that we are capturing CO2 emissions from the steel and paper mills in the UK. And then we are taking that CO2 and it is being converted into something called surfactants. And that is effectively the products that go into your shampoo, shower gel. So it's the chemical that separates grease from water. So if you can imagine how much it goes into. But the clients on that are Unilever, Procter & Gamble, Johnson Matthey, Reckitt, BASF, chemical manufacturers. And the idea is that we're looking to decarbonize the whole supply chain for chemicals. Because it's not just a one company answer, right? So the industry has come together. It's taken them 3 years to do it. They've come together and they said, right, we need to work with the emitters. We need to work with the technology providers. We need to work with the chemical manufacturers and the researchers. So we've got 2 universities on there, Sheffield and University of Surrey. But we also need to work with the end users. So Unilever will put it into Fairy washing up liquid, or it will go into, Reckitt will put it into Dettol or Finish dishwasher tablets, or the other one that we're looking to do is Ariel detergents. So these are the journey that it needs to take isn't just a one company journey. It's a it's a collaboration piece. And the industry recognise that actually if we wait for government to do this, or if we wait for regulation, it's not going to happen. So we need to come together as an industry. And then people quite often say, well, why? Why is the industry concerned about, the chemicals industry concerned about this? Because if you imagine something like 5.4 billion tonnes of fossil carbon that we mine goes into materials and chemicals. That's a lot every year. Now, if we get to net zero, we have to stop mining fossil carbon. If we stop mining fossil carbon, what are we going to put into our shampoos and shower gels? And nobody's really given that any thought, right? So if you think about it, if we also get to net zero quicker, i.e. we move to renewables, say we're suddenly doing everything, we're not having to mine fossil carbon because we're doing everything, whether it's wind, solar, whatever, then the industry is again at threat, because which company is going to mine 5.4 billion tonnes of fossil carbon just for the sake of the chemicals industry? So these are the kind of things we need to think about. And the Flue2Chem project, that alone has the capacity to remove 15 to 20 million tonnes of CO2 every year just in the UK alone. So it's government-backed. It's a world first. Obviously, we've got 17 companies on there, most of which are blue-chip major companies, and we've been selected as a technology provider. So we have deployed to one of the sites already, and we're capturing CO2. And if anyone's interested, it looks like water when you liquefy it, because most people have never seen it, but it does. It's just completely clear.
And as I said, that just sounds like a lot to take on, So as a founder, I'd love to know what that experience has been like for you, Beena, to go into this and take on that, because that sounds like a big job,
Yeah.
A very critical, important one. And what has this experience been like for you personally?
Do you know what? It's been quite a journey. I think sometimes if I stop, and because it's been so fast paced, I think if I stop and think about it, there's a chance that doubt might creep in, or, and I tend not to stop and think about it. But I've had my challenges. I'm not going to I'm not going to lie and say I haven't had my challenges. I've had my challenges since birth. Most of us come from different backgrounds and, we've learned things in different ways. But I think for me, I come from a background of hardship. So even though I was one of 5, I was number 4. My father passed away when I was 6 months old, and my mum was pregnant with my younger brother. So I've always had to pretty much not fend for myself, I would say. We were quite a tight family unit, but I didn't grow up knowing what it was like to have a father, because I never had a father. So you can't miss something you've never had. And I guess I've always known that if my career and my life was going to go a certain way, I didn't have somebody supporting me through that. And I guess because it wasn't like I had it and then it got taken away. That was just the way that life was. You made what you needed to make of your life. If you went to school and studied, it only benefited you. Nobody was going to help you along the way. So I was the first person in my family to go to university. I worked and got myself through university. It was something I had to, and most people take this for granted. I had to fight to get to university, because it wasn't something that was typically normal in my culture, particularly because I didn't have, a father, and I didn't have that male figure in the house. So I had to really fight to get myself to university. I had to convince my family, my mum particularly, that this was something that was needed. And I didn't want to go down the same route that my brothers and sisters had gone down, because look, I had 3 older siblings, right? And it didn't work. That wasn't the life that I wanted. So I had to work really hard. So I've had to work really hard to get what I want out of life from day one. And my journey itself has, oil and gas was a tough gig. Went to Nigeria, 6,000 men, and then there's me. The only other females are probably the local tea ladies, the local cleaners, and then a couple of female local engineers. But it was, it was an experience, I would say. And I would say it was the best and the worst experience of my life. At that age, 22 years old, you're thrown into this country that is completely different from what you've ever experienced before. And you have to adjust. And it was hard. And that's when I think some of those biases creeped in that I could then see. I never really noticed them before. And I think it's because as much as I did lead slightly a sheltered life, because we didn't have a father, we didn't do a lot of the things that families would do. So I didn't experience that much. But when I got to Nigeria, suddenly it was just me on my own in this, and I was surrounded by a lot of men. Much of my team, all of my team were male. And things started creeping. I was treated differently and I didn't like it. And in those days I would cry about it because, that's what you do when you're that age and you don't know what else to do. And I didn't really have much of a voice, but I think it toughened me up. And I think as I came through the industry and I did other things, when I moved to Aberdeen, it's coming up to 7 years now, I was actually quite taken aback in Aberdeen because I felt like I'd stepped back into that old oil and gas. I felt like I'd stepped back into, the industry itself is quite misogynistic. I'm not going to lie, and my colour probably didn't help. I remember when I was first being selected to go to one of our sites around the world, I was told by my manager that I was the wrong colour, the wrong gender, the wrong age. I wasn't an engineer, and I think it was Australia was the option. And he said to me I was wrong and I just went, oh, okay then. Because what else do you do when you're 21 years old,
Yeah.
Okay, then you must be right. I must be the wrong colour and I must be the wrong. And now I think back and I think if he'd said that to me now, God, he would have got a completely different response. And I probably wouldn't have a job. But, that taught me that what I didn't like, that showed me what I didn't like very, very quickly. And I recognized that actually if I start to behave like I'm different, then I will get treated like I'm different. I have to not accept that I'm different. And I think that helped me quite a lot in the journey. When I moved to Aberdeen, I struggled because I was expecting the industry to have moved on. And in Aberdeen, I felt like it had gone backwards. And I do quite often say that I have never experienced the level of sexism and racism in the world, given that I've travelled so much, in comparison to what I've experienced in Aberdeen. And that, I think, shook me to my core because I didn't know how to deal with it. And initially it upset me and it held me back. And I was scared to put myself out there. But, when I think about some of the criticism that I've received, quite often to my face, I think about the types of people that you either do one of two things, right? You either go, oh my God, yeah, they're all right. I'm not right for this. I don't look right. I don't sound right. Or you say, do you know what? Actually, I need to prove you wrong. And I decided that was a much more, it took me a couple of weeks, And then I decided that, do you know what? Actually, I am that person. I'm not the person that's going to sit down and say, yes, you're right, and just stop doing what I'm doing. And what am I doing this for? I'm doing it for myself. I'm doing it for my business, for my family. I'm not doing it for their approval. And I just thought, and gradually I learned, coming from a psychology background, I had to be the one, I was quite often the one telling people how to motivate, teaching people how to motivate them, how to motivate others, how to pick yourselves up after, a fall. And I'm like, if I can't do that myself, then what's the point? So I had to be. And especially when you're leading a company, the people that you've got, whether it's your co-founders or the people that work for you, they have to be able to see that in you, even if you don't feel it. And I just thought to myself, the longer I can keep that facade up, the better for the team, the better for the technology, the better for the business. And then it just becomes a part of you and it just becomes natural to do. It becomes very normal to do. I don't feel like I'm working really hard to put this face on anymore. And just yesterday, another female founder said to me, God, you're so confident. And I said to her, it might seem it from the outside, but it isn't always from the inside. But if I let it show from the outside, that's when people take advantage. And that's when people say, it's okay to tell her she's the wrong color. And it's okay to tell her that she doesn't fit in this industry because she's a woman. So it's what you put out externally is really important, because it does set those barriers. And that's what I've had to do. So the journey hasn't been easy, but then whose has been, right? But I do think what is unique about me and others that have done, been in a similar space to me, yes, there are very few women that do what I do. And then you add in the color element to it, and that's a complete other story. We often hear about, women only get certain percent investment. And they're like, well, add a bit of color into that and you'll soon find out that actually that 2% is pretty good. We know these challenges. We're told these challenges all the time. Every time you pick up, an article, you read an article, it tells you how badly women are treated, and I just thought somebody has to change the narrative. Somebody has to start to change the narrative, right? And it's about the language that we use. It's about what we put out, how people perceive us. I speak to a lot of female founders, and I do a lot of stuff in encouraging more women into the energy space. I'm one of the co-founders of a Women in New Energy initiative in Aberdeen, because I recognise that actually a lot of women in Aberdeen want to move their careers forward in the space. They want to move into the new energy, renewable space, net zero space, but they're lacking guidance, they're lacking support, because mostly they're not getting it from their male counterparts. They haven't got the allies that they need, and don't need to convince us as women, but it's the allies we need are the men. So the purpose of what we're doing is actually to try and get more allies on board to help support some of these ambitious women. And that's something that's very close to my heart, because having gone through what I've gone through in the industry, and in particular in Aberdeen, I feel like it's really important. So for me, it's a case of, be what you want people to see you as, right? And represent the business. So if I put a press release out on December the 5th, and I get criticism for putting that press release out, which I have done, for being the wrong color or the wrong gender or whatever it is to be doing what I'm doing. Who does she think she is? How's she ever going to achieve that? I think to myself, if that had been a man that put that out, he would have got a huge pat on the back and he would have been told, well done for being so bloody ambitious. But women are not allowed to be ambitious. We're not allowed to put public statements out that say we're going to achieve this, that, and the other. And I do believe once you put it out in the universe, you make that happen because you've committed to that. And so that was a big step for me to put that out in the press. And then when I got criticism for it, it was upsetting, and it did put me down for a very long time. 3 weeks might not be long for most people, but it's a long 3 weeks for me. And then I came to the realization, actually, what did I achieve from that was positive? And on the 5th of December, I put that press release out. On the 6th of December, an investor reached out to me from Hong Kong with investment. And they're still my investors. So I thought to myself, do you know what? Actually, what I need to achieve is much bigger than what people are saying I can or cannot do. And I just thought, you know what? It's probably time I showed them what can be done, particularly when you've had so much negativity against you. So, and I say if I can do it with all the stuff that I've had to go through and I've had to face, then anyone can do it. And it's not a case of being female, because there's the intersectionality part as well. Most females it's not just being female that goes against them. They might have come from a deprived background. They might come from a broken family, but they also might have a disability. They might have, come from a different ethnic background. So most females are not just saying, well, I'm female and that's the only thing that goes against me. There's multiple things. And we don't talk about that enough, particularly in Scotland, around intersectionality. We talk a lot about females, but we don't talk about intersectionality. And we need to do more of that.
You're just a massive inspiration, Beena. Just hearing all of that is just incredible. And I think that you really have showed these arseholes. I just think that you've just
That's a polite way of putting it, yeah.
Anyone that doubts someone, what is the point? You have just got to believe in people, and you've just done so incredibly well, and you have been showing them, who's boss.
I think it's a mindset change that needs to happen, because it's not the problems that we have in society aren't going to go away overnight, right? We've done a lot of work in this space, but at the same time, we've still got a long way to go.
Yeah.
So what can we do different? And it's the mindset change. And I say to people, doubt me. Just fucking doubt me. And I'll show you. I'll show you.
Well, you have been showing them because you've won like a ton of awards as well, haven't you? What's the list?
Oh my gosh,
what's the success so far?
I mean, we won. So this was quite a funny one. We won FSB. It was Scottish Innovation Award back in March, and I couldn't make it. I can't remember. I was traveling, so I sent some of the team, Peter and Francis, to collect it from Butte House. And they went along to this event, and I think Peter, who's used to being on camera, he does loads of media stuff. As an academic, a professor, you can imagine, he does a lot of that stuff. And he, I think the interviewer said to him, "So what are your team going to say when you take this award back? What are they going to say when you take this award back to them?" And he said, "I think they're going to say we need a bigger shelf." Yeah, so Peter, trust Peter. But it's been great. I mean, in 1 week, we won 4 awards, 2 Scottish awards, one for Global Startup and 1 Green Startup. And then we won, in that same week, we won FSB UK Innovation Award. And we also won FSB Small Business of the Year, which I think last year we applied for a few and we won a few, but we weren't quite there yet because we hadn't really deployed on the Unilever, on the Flutichem project with Unilever and the Society of Chemical Industry. And we just knew that this year was going to be the year because we'd obviously deployed and now we were actually on that journey. So, proving lots of people wrong who said this couldn't be done, not just me as a person and my business, but also the technology. Peter has stories of 10 years of being told this technology is never going to work. And he tells people quite often, everybody said to me, this technology isn't going to work for the best part of 10 years. So we've got his drive in proving that the technology is going to work and it can be scaled. And it can be a major disruptor, which it is. And at the same time, we've got from a business perspective. Now, you have to remember that the space that I'm in is very unique. It's never been done before. Climate tech isn't something that people have got experience in. I remember there was, quite recently, I was talking to, obviously we've been talking to investors, and quite recently they came back and they rejected us. And one of the reasons was they didn't feel that the management team had adequate enough experience in scaling this type of business. And I felt like going back and saying, well, this hasn't been done before. Nobody's done it. I mean, you try and find me somebody who's started and scaled and exited a climate tech business. It's almost unheard of because it wasn't something 5, 10, 15 years ago. It's very, very recent. And you think about like companies like organizations like McKinsey's, for example, who have stated that there will be 300 decacorns created in the climate tech space in the next decade. They've got to come from somewhere, right? Why not Scotland? So these are the kind of questions that we should be, the opportunity. And I say to people, when people talk about, particularly women talk about moving into this space and where they've struggled, especially if they come from the energy industry, right? When I started in the energy industry, I was up against white men with 20 years experience. It was a tough gig. But this space, there is no white man with 20 years experience in this space against me. There's opportunity. And I'm telling you, 50% of the technologies that we need haven't yet been invented. So why can not people that look like me say, actually, this is an opportunity. And I'm not up against a man with 5 or 10 or 15 years experience anymore. And that's how I put it.
We'll definitely watching a movie about you one day, Beena. I think it's fantastic of just like how you've approached it. And I think that, hearing your story of what you went through when you're, from such a young age, and then just how hard you've had to fight, just comes across of just your determination and passion for obviously succeeding here. And it's a massive inspiration. But, in terms of the Scottish ecosystem here, how have you leveraged support here in Scotland, and what partners have you worked with?
One of my biggest supporters, I think, is Barclays. I've had phenomenal support from Barclays, actually, from day one. Obviously, being in the climate tech space automatically puts us into high growth, which opens up a lot of doors. But it's not that. It's been the personal approach. There are certain people in Barclays that have that really care about the businesses that they support. At a very high level as well. I'm not just talking about sort of that relationship manager level. I'm talking much, much higher up the chain. There has not been anything that I haven't been able to pick up the phone or send an email to some very senior people in Barclays and say, hey, look, this is new. Is there anybody in Barclays that can help me? And they've been one of my biggest supporters. And have opened so many doors, not just from an investment perspective, but also from client, customer introductions, etc. And events, networking events has been great. I mean, I was at Wimbledon yesterday in the Barclays Hospitality Suite. Phenomenal opportunity speaking to some of the people in there from the businesses that potentially could be my clients. So these are the kind of opportunities that have been sort of handed my way. The other organization I would say that I really started my journey with is it was a startup grind, but now it's Forest. And the people behind that have been phenomenal and really pushing female founders. And I went on a trip with them, I think it was 2 years ago, with the biotechnical business. And that's really where the whole spin out of CCU started, because they got me in front of investors in Silicon Valley and all they wanted to know about was the carbon capture. So I went on that trip and I remember, it's actually quite funny, I remember getting to the airport and seeing these 19 other founders. And I remember phoning my husband and saying, I don't think I'd ever choose these people as friends. Like, they're so different from me. How am I going to manage a week with these people? And that was the beauty about that particular trip. And one of the things I love about Forest is that the diversity that was out there was what I call true diversity, not just female, male, but there was gender, ethnicity, gender. There was also diversity in thinking, because, we had some neurodiverse people. It was really quite unique. And we came together and we bonded. Honestly, they were like, it was just amazing. And it just goes to show that even with difference, sometimes those relationships are so unique. And that, I think they definitely deserve a shout out. And I've been London Tech Week recently with them, and I was in Lisbon at Web Summit with them as well. Again, very diverse people that you wouldn't normally even, you wouldn't normally pull to them in a room or anything like that. And that was what was really lovely about it. So their true thinking around creating diverse groups of founders is phenomenal.
Yeah, the Forest team do fantastic. So I work with Nick and Carol, and we're in the Startup Grind. So we still have Startup Grind Scotland, and we have Forest as well, which is great. And Forest have just done fantastic with actually taking people out of Scotland to go to these huge events and to be able to just open your mind, South by Southwest, Silicon Valley, all those incredible things. And I think it's so great that you got to partake in that, because we have to open our minds. I mean, this is, what we're trying to do with the Braw Tech Podcast is we want this to be a connection to the rest of the world as well. We want to be able to tell your story so that people over in the US can hear this. So people across Europe, it's not just about telling the story here in Scotland for Scotland. So thank you so much, Beena, for sharing all of that. So just a couple more questions that I'd love to find out a little bit more. In terms of, what's next for CCU International, what you're excited about right now?
Yeah, I think it's, we've obviously done a lot, right? We've only been doing this for 18 months. And I think we sometimes need to remember that we've only been doing this for 18 months. And although externally it appears that we've done all this stuff, we're all over the place, all over the world, doing all these projects with all these major clients, and winning all these awards, for us, the journey hasn't quite begun. And that's what's so exciting, because we know what we can achieve with our technology. And we know the industries that we can impact. We know the massive impact we can have on climate change. So we're still really early stage. Yes, the technology is very unique. It's groundbreaking. And yes, we've delivered, we're commercial, but there's so much more that needs to happen. And that is from taking the technology and scaling it, applying it to other industries, taking it global, because this technology isn't just a technology that applies to one region or one industry. It is industry agnostic. And even if, and we call it a transitionary technology, right? At some point, we want to get to a point where it's not needed. But let's be real. Fossil carbon is going to be around for a long time. So chances are it will be needed. And there are countries particularly for me, like some of these third world countries that are in a lot of regards lagging behind, but actually by utilizing our technology, they could really bring themselves to the forefront very quickly. And the key thing is for us as a technology provider is keeping those costs down, right? Because if you get to a point where carbon capture becomes too expensive, then nobody's going to want to do it. It becomes right now it's a cost exercise. So you capture CO2 at cost, you compress it, you liquefy it, you transport it at cost, you inject it, which is what we plan to do in Scotland, at cost, and then you monitor it for maybe 1,000 years before it stabilizes. But that's all done at cost. And then the expectation is that taxpayers will pay for that. Now, if it's only a cost exercise, it's going to be much harder to convince an organization, an emitter, to take that cost on, unless there's some incentives, whether it's carbon credits or whether it's subsidies from government, whatever that looks like, or the avoidance of paying carbon tax, for example, emissions tax. Our focus really is on creating revenue streams, because remember I said carbon is a commodity, right? We need it for everything, for pretty much everything we touch and feel. So the idea is, and this is one of the reasons why we've had the success, because our model is quite unique. We not only capture these CO2 emissions and remove the emissions tax, carbon tax, etc., but we create multiple revenue streams. So remember I said we can put it into product, or we can either liquefy it and we can put it into food and beverage. So most people might ask the question, well, hold on a second. Existing solutions, why can't you put that into food and beverage? And remember I said that most of them use hazardous substances and they're carcinogenic. So organizations like Brew would never accept carbon, or they could do. There's no regulation really stopping, but it's a public, it's a consumer product, isn't it? So imagine consumers, you finding out that the carbonated drink from your can comes from a capture system that uses a carcinogenic substance, cancer-causing substance. It's not going to go down too well. Because we don't use any hazardous substances, we don't have that problem. And that's why our technology is unique. So we can resell that back into multiple industries, but you can also take the CO2 and put it into, and again, when I say we've got all these technologies, they still need to be developed. So we need to develop technologies that help us utilize that CO2 back into aviation fuels, diesels. Surfactants is obviously very new, what we're doing. So the exciting part is looking at what happens next through that value chain, because we can do that, no problem. And we can do it cheaper, we can do it smaller and all the rest of it. But the next stage is, what are the technologies that are going to be coming along, which potentially we might incorporate or develop ourselves into using that technology to create that circular carbon economy. So one of the projects that we're doing is in Hong Kong, which takes captured CO2 and then puts it into construction material, for example. And that locks the CO2 in permanently, assuming that the building doesn't fall down anytime soon. But that's and you can generate, if you can lock the carbon in, then you can generate revenue streams by also creating what we call carbon credits, which can then be traded, high value carbon credits. And that's when I talk about companies that have carbon emissions they measure, and then they're like, oh, we need to offset, we buy some carbon credits. And that's where it comes from. So they can sell these or trade these carbon credits. So that, for me, the most exciting part is what hasn't yet been invented. Obviously, we know this is just the start. People say to me like, you've had so much success. I don't feel that at all. And I think that's probably what drives me is we're not there yet. We're not even nearly there. Like, we've just started. And we know the challenges that we face going forward. It's regulation. It's changing mindsets of existing organizations that are doing, that are currently capturing carbon. As I mentioned, it's being transparent. The industry lacks transparency. So we feel like not only are we a technology provider, but we're also trying to change hearts and minds, because that's a big part of our journey. And that's what we're doing. Imagine next year when here you go, here's a bottle of fairy washing up liquid that comes from captured CO2. That's the kind of stuff that captures hearts and minds, because people can see and feel and relate to it because they use it every day. So our job isn't just as a technology provider and build a business, build revenue, exit, etc. Our job is as educators, which is one of the reasons why I spend a lot of my time traveling and educating people on what they can do with CO2 and ways in which they can capture it, which is more carbon efficient. And that's where the exciting part of that journey comes in, when we start to see technologies develop that bolts onto our technology. And we should be able to go to a client and say, we can capture your CO2 emissions, and here are the multiple opportunities of things that you can do with it. And this is what revenue you can generate, because there's a technology over there that does aviation fuel. There's a technology back there that does construction material. And that's the exciting part, seeing when that comes up. Once we've got that whole value chain sorted, that's when I'll feel like we've been a little bit more successful.
Well, that is fantastic, Beena. Thank you so much for sharing all that story. I have 2 more questions for you. We always ask our guests to give a shout out to a fellow founder or a startup or company somewhere else in the world that you admire or just enjoying watching their journey. So just who's your shout out for today?
Yeah, I mentioned Hong Kong. And interestingly, we've got quite close relationships with Hong Kong. And I mentioned that was literally the day that the press release went out. They sent me an email and they said, how do we get involved? How do we invest? How do we fund? How do we partner? So they are not only our investors, they're also our strategic partners, but they're also founders themselves. And interestingly, they have set up a company that will help us deploy our capture system. So they are an ex-client. So we've obviously got the Flutichem project that's going in Cumbria at the moment, a paper mill, Holman paper mill in Cumbria. But our next project, which goes out this month, in about 2 weeks, a week and a half, it goes out. It will get shipped to Hong Kong. They have invested as a startup. They have invested, or they've got investors on board. They have not just invested in us, but they have also invested in a biomass plant, which basically produces something called biochar, which is, I'm not going to go into it now, but it's phenomenal. If anybody wants to read up it, just Google it. But it's a biomass plant that burns wood. So obviously Hong Kong, they have typhoons and stuff. So you want to do something with the wood. So they utilize that wood to turn into biochar, which can then go into farming and agriculture. It's phenomenal stuff. But when you're burning wood, you're emitting CO2. So what they wanted to do was demonstrate a capture system that could capture the CO2 emissions. And this is on the one site, right? So on the one site, they are creating this biochar from waste wood, if you like. The CO2 emissions is going to be captured by our capture system. And then they are taking that CO2 and on the same site, injecting it into the curing process for building blocks and bricks. And so it locks the CO2 in. And that is on the same site. So their background is construction. They're responsible for a large percentage of the construction material in the Southeast Asian region. And they are keen to produce low carbon, sustainable building blocks because that's what everybody wants, right? Lock the carbon into the building blocks, create the credits. So that I think will be a world first as well. And I wanted to give them a shout out because they're quite a young team and they have just been so forward thinking in their approach. I mean, to approach us and say, we want to do this in Hong Kong. And that has then opened doors for a lot of the multinationals in Southeast Asia. She was just waiting for that demonstration. It'll be commissioned in September because it's a long journey to Hong Kong, especially when we've got the issues that we've got in the Suez Canal. So it's slightly longer route. But once it gets there, we're hoping to commission in September, and then we will have some of the world's largest companies come and have a look at what we're doing to potentially deploy to their own sites. So CS Tech, they're called CS Tech Solutions.
I was just going to ask what the name was. Yeah. CS Tech.
CS Tech Solutions, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Beena. So last one, just one word to sum up your experience so far as a founder.
One word. Well, there's loads I could say, and I'm sure some of the others will say, the kind of standard roller coaster, etc. But I think for us, it's probably magical because it has been magical. I mean, some of the stuff that's happened has almost happened. It's almost untrue. You think about some of the things. I mean, winning 4 awards in 1 week. And I just said to the guys, right, we need to stop applying for awards because there's no way we're going to beat that record. No way. But it's things like that. Just, and I think maybe because we haven't expected much. Then when things happen, it's just completely magical. And so I think that would be my one word, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Beena, for coming on the Braw Tech Podcast. It's been such a pleasure and a massive inspiration just hearing your journey and everything that you're working on. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great. I mean, if this allows, hopefully people watching this, if this allows particularly women in this space, if it allows them to kind of say, you know what, there's a way, it can be done. The one thing I will say is fuel yourself on the doubt, fuel yourself on the that should be your fuel. The negativity should be your fuel because the good stuff is great and we should celebrate it. But actually the negative stuff can hit us much, much harder than the impact that the positive stuff can have. So I would say use that as that's what I do. I use the negativity as my fuel to do better, to do more. And that would be my last. But yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Beena. Thank you so much for everyone for tuning into the Braw Tech Podcast with Beena. It was an absolute pleasure. So thank you again. Thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you again soon. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode. This series is produced by Duke. And if you would like to find out more, please go to dukeagency.com.